As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, history was speeding up. The pace of change was quickening. New forces were at work, and men felt a new confidence. Confidence in new technologies, confidence in exhilarating new ideas, confidence that change was for the better, confidence in progress. Forward, forward, let us range, let the great world spin forever, down the ringing grooves of change. So wrote the poet Tennyson in the middle of the 19th century. And by then his countrymen were sure that they were the heirs of the ages, heirs to the cumulative scientific, moral, cultural achievements of the world, and sure too that they had a message for the world. This must be one of the best-known landmarks in London, the Albert Memorial. A monument to a prince, and a very special prince, a man who, among other things, thought that his finest moment had been the organization of the Great Exhibition of 1851, the show which first revealed to the Victorians the enormous extent of the wealth and abundance which industrial civilization could offer to them. Prince Albert was a man who liked to think of himself as abreast of the foremost ideas of his age, a modern-minded man. His monument is a complex allegory of the progressive mythology of the age. On top of it stands the cross, central symbol of a Christianity still supreme, supported by angels. And a little lower down come the Christian virtues of faith, hope, charity, humility. They still have pride of place. But only just below them come agriculture, commerce, engineering, manufacturing, the handmaidens of the new, practical, Victorian gospel of progress. Indeed, in the 19th century, progress became for some people an idol, a sort of fetish. It was taken for granted it was the test of a civilization, whether it could produce change, and change of a kind which would bring improvement. Civilization, it was thought, ought not merely to accept change, but to seek to bring it about, perhaps even to impose it on those who didn't want it by force. So the Victorians institutionalized change by setting up organizations to promote science and research and to monitor the progress of what Tennyson called the march of mind. There were some who had doubts, who wondered about the costs of progress and what it might bring. But they were in a minority. More thinking people in the Western world than ever before in the 19th century took the view that the world was getting better all the time and it was going to go on in that path. One reason for that confidence was that one age-old spectre had gone away. There was at last, in one country after another, enough food to feed a hugely increasing population. Europeans had been at work finding ways of growing more food as far back as the Middle Ages. It was in the 18th century that things really began to change, above all in England. There, great landowners, not only noblemen but commoners like Thomas Cook of Norfolk, led the way. In 1776, Cook had inherited not only a magnificent Palladian house at Hokum and one of the largest agricultural estates in England, but a seat in Parliament. Both public affairs and a flair for business drew him to the improvement of sheep by scientific breeding. In due course, his grateful tenants put up a monument to celebrate not only the wealth Cook's thoughtful husbandry had generated, but the beasts and the people who seemed together to be able to produce such plenty from the smiling land. More wool, more meat per acre than ever before. Soon, farmers all over England were experimenting with ways of developing new strains of animals for particular purposes. And as a result, the physical appearance of animals altered. New, improved agricultural buildings were erected. As the animals are the living, so these are the architectural monuments to an agricultural revolution. The manipulation of nature produced new strains of crops. Perhaps the countryside George Stubbs painted was never anything like as Arcadian as it looks in his pictures, but it was the ultimate source of a new and growing wealth. The agricultural revolution was an event in human history of colossal importance, spreading beyond England and eventually around the world. It was, in a way, what made modern history possible, the material foundation of our world. Huge changes in expectations have been brought about by the revolution in agriculture, changes which are still at work. And the upshot of all those changes after centuries was abundance, wealth, plenty. Plenty on a scale hitherto unimaginable, even if today we've come to take it for granted or to think of it in terms of the problems of grain mountains and intervention prices. But they wouldn't have seemed to be problems to the people who lived in the old rural society where hunger was an inescapable daily fact of human existence. That society was transformed by the agricultural revolution. It swept through it, knocking down immemorial landmarks, overthrowing old ways of doing things, transforming old relationships. Changed urban life too. Towns and cities could grow faster and larger than ever before because their populations could be fed. And it changed the economic organization of the world. Parts of it, which had previously been self-sufficient, growing their own food, now became dependent on importing food, and other parts of it became suppliers, dependent on the markets they supplied for their livelihood. And all the time, the wealth went on mounting up, not just to the benefit of the rich landowners who were the obvious beneficiaries to begin with, but a net addition to the wealth of society. Capital for other changes. Capital, above all, for the greatest change of all, the greatest change that ever swept through Western society, and indeed, the biggest single break in the history of humankind since the invention of agriculture itself 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. That break was industrialization. There was a time when industrial society had existed nowhere on Earth. No one had even conceived such a thing. But throughout the centuries, very slowly, machines had come to be driven by something other than muscle power. And to operate the machines, more and more labor was brought together under one roof, collectivized for greater efficiency, subjected to the disciplines of an employer who had the capital to bring all the elements of a new system together. One of the first signs of such changes was the appearance all over Europe, often in little river valleys near to large centers of population, of isolated mills and factories. And yet, for a long time, industry made little difference to the way the world looked, or to the way most men got their living. The economy was still overwhelmingly rural. But more convulsive changes lay ahead. The real announcement of a new economic and technological world was the harnessing of steam. The power that steam might unleash had been dimly understood over 2,000 years ago. But it was only in the 18th century that it became possible to harness it effectively for industry. In the 19th century, steam rapidly became a source of energy which dominated manufacturing. It made industrial Europe possible. Yet it was before that, as early as 1830 or thereabouts, that a Frenchman invented the useful phrase, industrial revolution, to startle people into realizing that what was going on rivaled or perhaps surpassed in importance the French Revolution, which still haunted everyone's minds. The impact of industrial revolution was soon felt worldwide. The process can still be traced by the physical trail it left behind it. Cities were larger and grew faster than ever before. In the 19th century, they spread at a spectacular rate, sucking in the unemployed of the countryside. And the great cities grew more and more hungry, not just for labor, but for the power that had brought their factories into being. Scientists had begun to explore electricity in the 18th century. After they invented the dynamo and the steam turbine in the next, they were on the way to another wave of an energy revolution. By the beginning of this century, electricity was becoming the dominant source of power in the Western world. And new means of creating power are being sought now with increasing ingenuity. Of course, we worry about the environment, safety, using up natural resources. Yet we still want the power. It's a long and complex road that gets us to the turbine room of a nuclear power station. Yet a Victorian engineer would take only a little time to understand the logical connection between the sort of things he used to do and what's going on here. He might, of course, be a little surprised at our concern over the use of nuclear power, because the Victorians were much surer than we are that the end of engineering is to bend nature to the purposes of man. And steam had also made possible a revolution in communication and transport. Great Britain was the first country to base her economic life on railways. Englishmen had in a generation learnt that the distance from London to Edinburgh was a matter of a few hours. Geography shrunk, regional differences were undermined, old closed markets were broken into. Soon the continents were crossed by them. In 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed. But before that, the United States of America had been spanned from sea to shining sea. Other means of communications were laid down too. The transatlantic cable from New York to London was finished in the 1860s. Soon the whole world was tied together by a network of telegraphy. In 1869, the Suez Canal was completed, shortening the passage from England to its Indian Empire by 5,000 miles. The map of trade changed, and with it the history of seaports. Some historic ports, like Venice, the great medieval focus of trade with the East, declined. They were in the wrong place to exploit the new pattern of world trade that was emerging in the 19th century. And ships changed. One modern ship could carry all the tonnage, landed in a year on the quays of medieval Venice. The ports which now flourished were oriented towards the Atlantic trade or had industrial hinterlands. A city like Hamburg, which had declined from its medieval importance, revived in the 19th century because its position gave it the handling of the wealth of an industrializing Germany. Germany, England, and America were by 1900 giants in a new industrial world. Their trade dominated an international market economy which was worldwide. So they built an economic system which means that now here in London you expect to find on the shelves pineapple from the Philippines, fruit cocktail from Taiwan, beans from California, frozen lamb from New Zealand, sugar from Mauritius, rice from Pakistan, and many, many other things from the world round. And we take it for granted, as it is taken for granted all over the Western world, in Frankfurt, New York, Rome, Chicago. The fundamental basis of that system was that Europe paid for the food and raw materials she imported from other parts of the world with with manufactures, with capital, and with services. But it quickly became far too complex to be described by any formula like that. By the end of the 19th century, it ramified into a system so complex that it really came to characterize a whole new age of history. And indeed, Marx referred to it and identified it as the bourgeois period of history. There was much that Karl Marx hated about it. Yet, in the Communist Manifesto, he described the industrial society which the bourgeoisie had made in awestruck, rhapsodic terms. It has, he said, executed works more marvelous than the building of Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. The subjugation of the forces of nature, the invention of machinery, the application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steamships, railways, electric telegraphs, the making of canals. What earlier generations had the remotest inkling that such productive power slumbered within the womb of associated labor? The bourgeois period of history, he also wrote, has to create the material basis of the new world. But the staggering increase in wealth which Marx so admired was often bought at a price which enraged him. Many of the great factories of the 19th century were appalling places to work in. The cost in suffering and deprivation to those who worked in them and who also lived in the industrial slums was colossal. The Industrial Revolution had been deeply corrosive of established ideas, settled ways, traditional society. It had also undermined a sense of obligation among fellow men. Not all factories were bad. Some owners did acknowledge that they had the responsibility, as well as the means, to ameliorate the hardships of an age of industry. The French Revolution of 1789 had launched on the world the idea of conscious political change. It challenged tradition, religion, natural law, the settled order of things. The French still celebrate the revolution each year. They've always seen themselves as guides and models for peoples less fortunately endowed with a gift for civilization. Many of the revolutionaries were sure that what they were about was of universal significance. Mirabeau, the brilliant, dissolute leader of the National Assembly, urged his countrymen to be the legislators of mankind. The priggish Robespierre, one of the architects of the Terror, once directed his auditors to be serious in their deliberations, as befitted men who were defining the interests of the world. The French Revolution was indeed a world historical event, and it couldn't be reversed once Bonaparte had given its ideas consolidation through time, domestic order, laws, and institutions. More or less continuously since 1789, France has had a National Assembly, and as the 19th century went on, other countries began to have parliaments too. That was why buildings like this one began to be put up all over Europe. And it's an expression in architecture of another very important consequence of the French Revolution. You might say it was the bringing to a culmination of the idea of the invention of modern politics. The Western notion, which has now spread around the world, that the way to make changes in public affairs and to run public business is by discussion, by bargaining in forums and marketplaces, whether by many people or by few. For most of human history, there wasn't such a thing. In the notion of politics as we know them, which was really not an idea very familiar outside anywhere except Great Britain and the United States before the French Revolution, in that there is the idea of a public good about which debate is legitimate and possible. And that's why those buildings went up. This one is the French Chamber of Deputies. And in them, politics tended to take a certain shape and form which owed something to another legacy of the French Revolution, the idea that you could focus the whole of politics around one central issue. It could be described as stability versus freedom, progress versus reaction, the past versus the future. And it was an idea which bent back to the language of left and right, which was invented in the revolution itself. In the earliest revolutionary assemblies, those who were against further movement down the revolutionary road sat on the president's right, and those who wanted to go further with it sat on his left. Of course, it's a very useful and helpful division. It's been one of the great creative myths of modern politics. It's never, though, been an exact description of what went on everywhere. After all, in English politics, it has never fitted exactly. We've always been used to the idea that there would be conservatives who would propound radical solutions to problems, while there would also be men who identified themselves at least as being on the left, who nonetheless would undertake a dogged defense of the status quo. But even if it didn't fit, it was a very useful organizing category for thinking about politics. And like the other legacies of the French Revolution, it has now gone round the world, and left and right are the language of politics almost everywhere. Such Western political ideas have proved very attractive outside the Western culture which gave birth to them. They've helped to challenge the past in every continent. They've been revolutionary importations. Almost everywhere, elections are now de rigueur, even in parts of the world ostensibly bitterly hostile to Western culture, like Iran. Even in such countries, the forms and political mythologies of the West can be seen at work. And so, too, are new secular faiths of the West, which have inherited some of the old power of religion. The most dramatically successful of these secular faiths have been nationalism and socialism. Let's start with nationalism, or rather, let's start with the name of the man who, a century or more ago, embodied the appeal and glamour of that idea as no one else ever did. Garibaldi, foreigner, born in Nice, and yet enormously popular in England, so popular that a little pub like this in the Thames Valley near Heathrow was named after him, and so were others. All over Victorian England, on mantelpieces everywhere, you could find figures like these, made in their thousands in the Staffordshire potteries for a mass market. In hundreds of gardens, you would find statues of Garibaldi, too. There was one, you may remember, in Mole's garden in The Wind and the Willows. Garibaldi was adored by all classes. When he came to London in 1864, the crowds were so thick in the streets that it took him 6 hours to cover 5 miles. And his carriage was virtually torn apart by his admirers. Duchesses were proud to be seen on his arm at aristocratic receptions, and one of them even drove him over to Eton so the boys could cheer him, and cheer him they did. Karl Marx, it might be remarked, thought that the whole visit was what he called a miserable spectacle of imbecility. But then the working class never turned out to cheer him as they cheered Garibaldi. It wasn't just because Garibaldi was a great gentleman, which he was, nor because he was the greatest guerrilla leader of the era, which also he was. It wasn't just because he was a splendid figure of a man. Someone said that he had the heart of a lion, though they went on to say that he combined it with the head of an ox. He was admired because he embodied a great cause and a great idea, the cause and idea of nationalism. At that time, the idea of nationalism was linked inseparably in men's minds with the ideas of liberalism and progress. It was an idea with a future. The illusions about it had not yet been blown away. And Garibaldi and the cause he represented embodied that idea. He was born in 1807 in Nice, not then a part of France, but part of one of the dozen or so little states into which Italy was divided. Garibaldi was the hero of those who wanted to unite those states into one nation and liberate Italians from Austrian domination. He became the outstanding guerrilla general of his age, and in due time he launched the final unification of Italy, starting in Sicily. It was to take 10 years to complete, and it was to need more than Garibaldi or any one man to bring it to a conclusion. But after he entered Naples in triumph in 1860, the outcome seldom seemed in doubt. The Risorgimento, as the great cause was called, had glamour, poetry, and practical lessons for non-Italians too. Garibaldi had gathered around him devoted followers. They were the first international brigade of brothers in arms in the cause of liberation. The Garibaldini, whose busts now look out over Rome, came from all over Europe. Poles, Hungarians, Irishmen, many others could see in Garibaldi's struggle one which was really their own. But national heroes can become embarrassments. Once unity was assured, Garibaldi was not discouraged from retiring from active politics. To his house on Caprera, an island off the Sardinian coast. He was revered by many, but distrusted by his country's rulers, and they were relieved when, in 1882, the old lion died at last. But his legend survived, and though he had been pushed into the background, that legend could be useful in building a sense of nationhood among peoples who had only the vaguest idea of what Italy was. But that's the way things have often gone since. First, independence, unity, then the creation of a sense of nationality from above, by pressure by officials, intellectuals, politicians, artists. In 1870, Italy was officially a nation state. There were no more Romans, Venetians, Sienese, Florentines. There were just Italians. And so, official Italy embarked upon a campaign to tell them just that. One result of it was this very startling building. It's the monument in Rome to the king under whom Italy was united, Victor Emmanuel II. Officially, it was called the Altar of the Fatherland. Rather more disrespectfully, it's been called the wedding cake, no doubt because of the brightness of the Brescia marble of which it's made, which is never likely to weather down to the pleasant, comfortable tones of the Roman houses which surround the monument. The allegorical statues stand for unity, liberty, self-sacrifice, and themes like that. Here in the monument is buried Italy's unknown soldier, and on the walls there are the names of the thousands of Italian dead from the Great War. In fact, it was to be decades before most Italians could feel that they were citizens of the new nation state. And I suppose the story is much the same in many of the new nations which have come into existence since then. Yet, as a moral principle, the Western idea of nationalism is now accepted worldwide. However much we might find it hard to agree about what actually constituted a people, we would all accept that it was wrong for a nation to be governed by foreigners or outsiders. And so nationalism was won. But it won only after a century and a half of some of the bloodiest wars in the whole of human history. And that's not really surprising, because 100 years ago, the idea of nationalism would not have been accepted even throughout much of Europe, let alone Asia and Africa. In those days, it might have been accepted that the Poles were a nation. It wouldn't have necessarily followed from that, in many people's eyes, that they had a right to self-government. The rights of princes and of dynasties would have seemed to them to have claims which were just as strong. The French Revolution had launched the idea of national sovereignty on Europe, where its first great revolutionary triumphs were to come. In just over a century, by 1919, the map of Europe was redrawn. The continent had been formally organized into nation-states. Since then, the myths of nationalism have not faded, in spite of the disillusions the years have brought. Nationalism still has unrivaled power to focus great human efforts, to make possible acceptance of privation and discipline on a huge scale. And now, its myths and symbols have gone round the world. New nations seem to be unable to do without such symbols. They testify how deeply nationalism has cut into traditional allegiances, even in so traditional a place as Islamic Oman. When young nations now celebrate their nationhood or their liberation from Western colonial power, as the Mexicans do every year, it nevertheless also demands the celebration of a Western idea. Nationalism is seen everywhere as part of the overall, progressive, worldwide march of humanity. But nationalism was soon followed by the other secular faith of the 19th century West, another force aspiring to change the world. Socialism can be defined in many ways. They all embody presumptions that privilege, rooted in birth or wealth, is wrong, that inequalities between men are wrong too, and that they should be corrected by political action. Working class unity was to achieve this. Some socialists still believe that the ideas of the French Revolution about liberty, equality, and fraternity are inseparably linked. But socialists tend to emphasize equality. And equality is now a commonplace of progressive politics all round the world. Yet such ideas first crystallized in Europe, and they owe their emergence to 19th century industrialism and the organization of European working men to defend their interests. This coal mine is in Carmaux, a little town in the south of France. Here in the early 1880s, a young French intellectual helped to organize the miners in a series of devastating strikes against the local magnates. That young man, Jean Jaurès, was, as a result, elected to the French Chamber of Deputies for this constituency. He was held in high affection locally. But there's hardly a town or village in France which hasn't got a rue or a place or an avenue Jean Jaurès. He was to become famous nationally as the dominant personality of French socialism.
Jaurès assassiné.
Perhaps he's more remembered inside France today than outside it. Yet in his day, he, like Garibaldi, had a European reputation. He became a socialist, intensely aware of the international implications of his faith, of the equality and brotherhood of man. The newspaper he founded was called, symbolically, L'Humanité, humanity. Jaurès also achieved international notice for the stand he made with Émile Zola and others in a famous cause célèbre, the notorious Dreyfus case. A Jewish officer in the French army had been unjustly cashiered and sentenced to Devil's Island. The ensuing row split France. Jaurès took up the defense of an individual whom some socialists wanted to ignore because he was a member of the ruling class. A coal miners' strike had put Jaurès on the road to political eminence, but he also led the local glass workers to a famous victory. And he was not just a great leader and inspirer of men in strikes, he had a practical side. He founded in Albi a glass workers' cooperative to make bottles for the vast numbers of local wine growers. Until 1984, it was still working on its original site, employing many workers in a collective, profit-sharing, democratic enterprise. Jaurès came gradually to socialism after he'd actually entered politics, and he came to it from an intellectual background. He was one of that small group of brilliant young men, a French elite, who would come up from the provinces to the École Normale Supérieure at Paris, the very apex of the highly selective French system of higher education. And after training there and graduation with distinction, he came back down here to the south to teach at Toulouse and taught the humanities, philosophy, and the classical languages. And even years later, when he submitted theses to the Sorbonne for his doctorate, the supplementary thesis was written by him, as they had to be in those days, in Latin. Its subject, incidentally, was the doctrinal origins of German socialism. Perhaps it's not surprising that with his intellectual qualities, and he was a fine orator too, Jaurès should have risen to be, by 1914, the dominating figure on the French socialist scene, and indeed one of the best-known figures in European socialism too. Not surprising, but very important. At that time, the prevailing trend in European socialism came from Germany, a somewhat rigid, deterministic Marxism. Now, Jaurès had read Marx, he admired him, he'd learnt a great deal from him. But his own socialism drew upon a different, more libertarian, less overtly deterministic French tradition. Perhaps that was why he was able at once to rally to the support of Dreyfus when the affair burst on the public, whereas other socialist leaders at that time saw in it nothing but a quarrel between members of the capitalist class which the proletariat could stay well clear of. Jaurès, though, saw it as connected with the ideas and ideals which he felt came down to him through the Revolution and from the great 18th century thinkers of the Enlightenment, the ideals of reason, tolerance, and which he felt socialism ought to supply the logical culmination to. And so as he set about completing the Republic by socialism, as he put it, what in fact he was also doing was putting forward to people who welcomed it a more sympathetic, more acceptable kind of socialism than that which they felt was embodied in the ideologically disciplined and dogmatic Marxism of the Germans. As the 19th century drew to a close, the public forum where such matters were debated was the Second International, the international organization of working-class movements which, it was hoped, might coordinate international efforts to bring about socialist victory. The Second International came to be bedeviled by the questions of how socialist goals should be achieved. German hardline orthodox Marxists claimed to be the keepers of the master's tradition. They strove to impose a formal unity on the movement. Others, Jaurès among them, advocated more pragmatic approaches. Jaurès used his newspaper, Humanité, to challenge the extreme ideas of the hardline Marxists and the nihilists and terrorists with his own gentler vision of the road to progress. Progress based less on economic determinism than on the, to him, self-evidently persuasive truth of the 18th century Enlightenment. It's ironic that Humanité, still bearing his name, was to pass after his death into the hands of the ultra-Stalinist French Communist Party. The German socialists were in wealth and organization the most powerful force in the Second International. Jaurès became increasingly preoccupied with one issue on which he sought their support: resistance to the danger of a new war. He mobilized all his formidable powers of oratory against the appalling prospect of an armed conflict in which the working peoples of Europe would slaughter one another. His stand made him hated by the French nationalists, still smarting from the Dreyfus affair. In the end, Jaurès' passionate efforts against war came to nothing, but perhaps he never quite knew that, because of a tragedy that happened here in this little Parisian bar just round the corner from his newspaper's office on the evening of the 31st of July, 1914. He'd spent a frantic day trying to see politicians to do what he could to avert the danger of war, and he came here in the evening for his dinner. And here, at about 20 to 10, he was murdered, shot dead by a young, unbalanced, inadequate man who actually believed the sort of things that the nationalist gutter press had been saying about Jaurès for weeks, that he was a pro-German, that he was a traitor, that he was a man trying, through his campaign against militarism, to undermine the national defenses of France. Like many a tragedy, Jaurès' murder was also deeply symbolic. When socialism and nationalism were weighed against one another, nationalism, almost everywhere, triumphed. Only a couple of days before, at the last pre-war meeting of the International in Brussels, Jaurès had himself learned that the anti-Russian feelings of the German socialists were going to outweigh their fear of war. It was ironical that only in two of the most backward countries in Europe, in little Serbia, where the whole diplomatic crisis, I suppose, had really begun, and in Russia, the most backward, tyrannical, least parliamentarian, least liberal of the great powers, only in those two countries did socialist deputies actually vote against the war credits which their governments asked for, though a Labour member of the cabinet in Great Britain did actually resign his office. Everywhere else, socialist internationalism went under in a wave of patriotic fervor. Only a couple of days after the murder, at Jaurès' funeral, socialists could be heard making speeches saying that he would have supported their call for national unity in a just war of self-defense. When the call-up papers came, German, French, Russian, Austrian workers fell in and joined the colours. And so the hopes and ideals of the Second International, that working-class fraternity would transcend frontiers, collapsed. It was the end of much else, too. Not least, the horrible weapons of modern war showed that industrial mass production could do other things besides creating wealth and improving man's lot. More important, though, the idea of progress itself, the optimistic belief of the Victorians in the advance of man, died on the battlefields of Europe along with the old European order and millions of its sons. And with them went an unexamined faith that humanity knew where it was going. The road lay upward to the light. The municipality of Carmaux thought that Jaurès' own name should be put on their war memorial. And ironically, they put his statue opposite it, to stare forever at the hundreds of names which commemorate the shattering of his hopes and the triumph of socialism's great rival. Just outside Albi is another reminder of the ironies of history. The cooperative founded by Jaurès has been rebuilt as a huge factory making bottles for the local wine growers, and very much in business still. In fact, it's the fourth largest bottle factory in France. But it's been obliged to modernize. Automation, time and efficiency studies, rationalization of labor have done their work. And now, the number of men actually employed at the cooperative is only a fraction of what it was in Jaurès' day. More than half the labor force has been forced to look elsewhere for work. Technology, the benevolent deity of the Victorians, turns out to be Janus-faced. Let the great world spin forever, down the ringing grooves of change, said Tennyson. And who now would dare predict any more the limits or the benefits of that course?